I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas. My work and this show is dedicated to educating, validating, elevating, and celebrating the importance of Black fatherhood. This is the Black Fatherhood Podcast. Abandoned as a baby to the British foster care system, Alex Wheatle grew up without any knowledge of his Jamaican parentage or family history. Preoccupied with his own roots, Alex grew inexorably drawn to reggae music, which became his primary solace through years of physical and mental abuse in a children's home. Alex's story takes us from his early years at the notorious Shirley Oaks children's home in London, through the Brixton Uprising as a teenager, to the front porch in Jamaica of a father who abandoned him as an infant 24 years earlier, all with a backdrop of reggae, homemade speaker boxes, soul food, friendship, and a lot of weed running throughout. Today we're speaking with an extraordinarily talented writer who has an equally extraordinary personal story about identity, absentee fathers, present father figures, and being a father himself. Alex Wheatle is the author of several best-selling books, including the young adult novels Kenosha of the Caribbean, Cane Warriors, and Homegirl, the modern classic Brixton Rock, and the award-winning Cronkton series. He is the subject of a historical drama film, which is part of a filmmaker Steve McQueen's lauded Small Acts anthology series on Amazon Prime. His body of work was a finalist for the 2021 NSK Newstart Prize for Children's Literature and has won numerous awards, including the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize. Alex recently published his memoir, Sufferah. Welcome to the show, Alex.
I'm glad to be here.
Sufferah is the title of Alex's book, and in the Jamaican dialect, it's the same as the word sufferer, which is a softer sounding but equally delegitimizing and dehumanizing experience or existence that many people live daily. Bounty Killer. The name might sound threatening, but he is actually a Jamaican reggae dancehall DJ and is considered one of the best dancehall lyricists of all times. In his song, also titled Sufferah, he chronicles the life of many young people like himself. He sings, "Born as a sufferer, grew up as a sufferer, struggle as a sufferer, make it as a sufferer, fight as a sufferer, survive as a sufferer. Youths in the ghetto, well, most of them are sufferer." The lyrics go on to speak to the legacy and desire of most parents in these conditions. Mama, she a sufferer. Papa, he a sufferer. Can't make me children grow up turn sufferer. Alex, tell us a little bit about these early years, your early years in South London, growing up in Shirley Oaks, experiences at school, in care homes.
My early life was very traumatic. The children's home where they sent me to, it was like a small village with about 40 or 50 mansion-like houses. And it would house up to 16 children of all ages. And the staff were quite brutal. In fact, it was quite Dickensian because the punishments they meted out, you would be physically abused with fire pokers or anything that came to hand, hairbrushes, shovels, and so forth. Even once, on one occasion, a cooking pot. And in the episode depicting my life in the Small Act series, it showed that a soiled bedsheet is thrust down my throat, where I almost choked to death. And so my young life was full of fear, trepidation, and not trusting any adults whatsoever. because they were my tormentor, and I felt it would never end.
Mm-hmm.
When you're a child, you just don't understand what's going on. And I guess the most painful time for me was every other Sunday, where other children would receive relatives, uncles, aunts, mums and dads, to visit them. And I would always wonder, where are my parents? And it would just crush my spirit. It really did. At that time, I did not even know that I was Caribbean, let alone Jamaican. Um, when I used to ask when I was a little older, they would say to me, "Oh, your parents came to the UK, left you on the dock of the bay, and went back to the jungle." So that's what I grew up with.
Mm.
So really, I had a lot of anger and wondering why the hell I was born or brought into this world. So it really was traumatic, and school was the same because I felt ashamed of my background. I felt I couldn't share or be honest with my background. I used to make up lies that I'm living with relatives, but you cannot come to my house because they're very strict that way, kind of thing. And I made up this family that obviously was a dream, and so I always
All right.
tried to hide it because of the stigma, if you like, So, but inside, I felt the lowest of the low. I even felt below the underclass. So that's how it was to me growing up. I had no self-esteem whatsoever.
So I'm thinking of this and listening to you at the same time. I like the description, which from what you're describing sounds very apt. That it was Dickensian, and of course, for those who are listening, pulling out of Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
and others. So I'm wondering though that as you're thinking, if you can take us back to that childhood period, because I took a look, I watched Small Acts, and from the very beginning, like it doesn't lure you in. It just starts off with the brutality and the trauma right off from the beginning, like right from the beginning. And it sounds like from what you're saying, that's exactly what your life was from the very beginning. There was no preparation for this trauma. It was just right off the bat. If you can help us understand what it must have felt like, what was going through your mind day after day, where were you as a person day after day going through these experiences?
Well, most of the time, it was just pure, unfiltered fear. Will I make it through the next day?
Mm-hmm.
I used to fear for my very life. And I'm talking about when I'm 5 or 6 years old. you know.
Mm.
So my mind was telling me, I was always in survival mode. Do not make a noise, do not try to be noticed. Make sure I do my chores in a proper way. Like for instance, if I'm told to collect the coal from the bunker, make sure I do not drop any lumps of coal on the carpet. Try not to wet the bed at night. It was just survival mode. I was always looking over my shoulder, thinking, right, what do I have to do to not get beaten up today? That was how I existed from as early as I can remember, from 4 or 5 years old.
And this is trying to
Yeah,
survive the people who were meant to care for you.
that is correct. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So feeling lonely
Yeah.
without family, not knowing who you are, where you came from, were emotions that ran intensely throughout the book. Were those ever present in your childhood?
Oh,
Some of the emotions that you talk about in your book.
oh yes. When you're at that tender age, you do not quite understand what these emotions you are feeling. I guess there's some kind of name for it, But obviously, I was a traumatized child from a very, very young age. And yes, I felt isolated, lonely almost every day of my young life until I got a little older and I managed to get myself a couple of friends.
Your memoir doubles as a history lesson of the West Indian community in London in the 1970s and 1980s. It also uncovers the tremendous racism and abuse from just about every figure of authority, culminating in the Brixton Uprising in 1981. Tell us a little bit about that time. Help us kind of get into that period of time.
I moved to Brixton in the late 1970s. I was 15 or 16. And it was a new experience for me because obviously I grew up in a white neighborhood. And so it was like a culture shock. So when new black friends told me to be wary of the police, I thought, well, why? The police are meant to help you, they're meant to assist you, they're meant to protect the community. But, I was told in no uncertain terms that they were the enemy. I thought, that confused me. But very early on, I'd experienced the way they spoke to young black people. I experienced the way they manhandled young black people. And there was a party in my hostel where I was residing. And at first hand, I witnessed and suffered from their violence. It just seemed so unnecessarily, just about the loudness of the music. And it seems everybody got arrested for that. And one of my strongest memories is sitting in a police cell and next door listening to this Rasta man in his 30s get the hell beaten out of him. 6, 7 police officers. I could hear almost today. I can hear the footsteps enter his cell, and the cell door clanging shut, and his hollering and his screaming and his wailing. And I was next door, and yes, I was physically abused as well on that night, but it was more terrifying listening to this man receive that violence rather than suffering it yourself. And so very quickly, you know, you realize that you're in again, survival mode. It was like I came from one institution of racism to another.
Yep.
I thought, oh Lord, here we go again. Here we go again. How do I survive this experience and this environment? It was just different uniforms for me.
So you just mentioned the incarceration or your arrest and incarceration that came out of your participation in the Brixton Uprising. But as part of that experience, it led you to a man who would change your life.
Oh, yes.
Tell us a little bit about Simeon.
Simeon, he was an incredibly well-read man because Brixton erupted in 1981, where young blacks finally fought back against the police, and Brixton burned for 3 days and 3 nights. And I was part of that. I was throwing bricks, petrol bombs, and the rest of it. And I thought I got away with it, but some weeks later, they came calling for me, and they basically dragged me out of my bed in my underwear, threw me in the back of a police van, and before I knew it, I was standing before a magistrate, and I was sentenced to a year's prison sentence. And I really thought that was the end of my days. I had no family to speak of. I really didn't think I had anything to live for. But my new cellmate was this Rastafarian. He seemed to be in his mid-40s, and he had this little bookshelf. And we had a fight, actually, where he got the better of me. He had me in a headlock. And he kept on saying to me, calm down, calm down, you know? And when I finally calmed down, he
Do you
wanted
remember what the fight was about?
the smell, the smell of the bucket toilet.
Ah.
He was suffering from diarrhea at this point, and I just couldn't take it anymore. Could not take it, and so I kicked off about that. But he knew something about judo or karate, and he obviously got the better of me because I was just wild, just throwing punches here and there. You know, I wasn't trained in any way in the martial arts, and he calmed me down. And I guess I had nowhere to go. So when he asked me, Alex, what is your story? I related my tale, and he was nodding his head. And I said to him that the only thing that gave me joy when I was a young child was reading, and a little later it was football. And so I was a big reader of comic magazines, especially if they contained any sports like football or cricket. And I said I like history too. And so he went to his shelf and he plucked out this book titled The Black Jacobins by the great Trinidad writer C.L.R. James. And he said, read that, man, read that, man. This will teach you enough things about your culture and your history. And that's what I did, and I would read that book every night. And because I was an avid reader, I was a very good reader, even though I had problems and issues at school. I was very much a good reader. From the age of 4 or 5, I was reading comics. And that taught me so much about Caribbean history and where we put up resistance. That was the important thing for me that wasn't taught to me in any of the schools I attended, where we were actively, trying to dictate our own history, if you like. We had agency in where we might end up, with the leader Toussaint Louverture and how he built an army and how he beat the French. That really inspired me, and I wanted more of those stories because so far, all I'd learned up to that point is that we were just docile slaves. And so that really corrected me in that term. And so I was just hungry to read more. And Simeon offered me more, and he would teach me life lessons, and he would try to elevate me from that position of very, very low esteem where I was lower than the lowest. He tried to lift me up and elevate me, especially my, what's the word I can use? The aspiration I had for myself, because I didn't really expect to be much before I met him. I mean, the most that I wished for was to be a DJ for a sound system. But he said, no, Alex, you can be whatever you want to be. Don't let your past hamper your future. And that would be a mantra that he would repeat again and again and again. He would not let me forget that. He says, you know, everyone is blessed in all kinds of ways, and you are blessed. Never forget that. And so I left prison with that belief that I could contribute something and I should work on what I'm good at. And that was writing down words, keeping a diary, writing lyrics, writing poetry. I was always a bit of a nerd because the music that I used to buy, I would study the back cover and I would discover who were the musicians on whatever album. Robbie Shakespeare, Sly Dunbar, the Revolutionaries, session musicians like that, who were singing backing vocals. I was a bit of a nerd that way. And sometimes they would write down the lyrics of a song in the middle of the album, and I would maybe add a verse of my own. I was very much like that. I was being creative in that way. And that led to writing of my own experiences. At first, it came out as poetry, and then it came out as like a diary. And then I started to perform from when I emerged from prison uh, in the fall of 1981 to the mid 1980s. I used to go around Brixton performing at small places, small bars, where anybody would have me, really. And that was a fantastic experience because at last, all the anger that had built up inside of me, I could start to unleash to the world, if you like. And, it wasn't so much a burden that I could share what I went through. So that was a great help. It became like therapy for me.
So you got this very cathartic experience
Yeah.
out of it. It's interesting that it is in a place that most people would expect degradation and loss of self that you find yourself. And you find yourself because of somebody, because of Simeon. Simeon looks over to you and thinks, this person is so full of promise. He is everything that you have not experienced in the quote unquote free world, in the real world. And it's almost as if Simeon was living out Bounty Killer's lyrics.
Yeah.
That mama is a sufferer, papa he a sufferer, but can't make me children grow up and turn sufferer. And he looked at you and thought, I can't let this young man grow up and be a sufferer. It's very, very powerful. I know later on you found your case notes from from various social workers and on some parts of your childhood, and that led you to want to dig even further to finding your parents and maybe understand their reason for abandoning you as a young child. So you eventually found your father in Jamaica. Walk us through that process of searching for your father.
I was conflicted about tracing him because I still had these angry thoughts about him because I learned from my case notes that indeed he was the one who placed me into care and he left me there. And so I found it very difficult to accept that, or even comprehend his decision that, okay, maybe there was a reason why he placed me in care because the pressure was too much for him. Because in those days, in South London, Brixton, there was not too much help for a black man trying to raise a young black baby. But what really hurt me is that he never returned. He stayed in Jamaica. And I could not, I could not reason that in my own head. I just couldn't. I thought that was inhumane at the time. So I remember Simeon's words. He said that you should embrace your father, embrace your mother, because they might be sufferers too. As Bounty Killer says, everybody's a sufferer. But the other half of me, the angry side of me, you know, wanted to basically thump him. And so I was very tense when I sat in my aeroplane seat on my way to Kingston Airport. And when I finally met him, those urges did come to the surface, but I'm glad that I managed to control them enough in order so we could have a conversation long into the night. And this is after he had about 3 or 4 cans of Dragon Stout, and I had about 3 or 4 glasses of rum and coke. And in the morning, he invited me to out for the day. We went to Port Antonio, and then we went to Port Maria, Noah Coward's old house, and because he was a poet and a playwright, and my father knew that I loved writing, I loved that culture. So that's the reason why he took me there. And from that point, we started to bond. And he liked cricket as well. And I absolutely adored cricket, especially the West Indies team of that period, the team with Richards in it. and Michael Holden and all those legends of the game. And so at least we could find a space that we could bond over. And that was a good thing. That was a good thing. So I would return every other year until his passing 11 years ago. And it was never the perfect relationship, but I'm glad that I knew him, because many of the children who I grew up with, we still don't know who they belong to, who their mothers or fathers might be. So now I look back, I kind of cherish those times I had with him, because at least I had the opportunity to get to know my roots.
So it sounds like you're talking about meeting him and coming to terms almost as if as a sufferer. But by the time you saw him, you were a father yourself. Yeah. And can you describe what it felt like meeting him both as a son and as a father yourself?
And I'm sure it was, when I look back, I'm sure it was because of the fact I was a father, that I was gentle with him. And I wanted to listen to him and what he had to say. I think before I became a father, maybe I would not have listened to him. And maybe I might have walked away or used a few swear words or whatever, just get all this anger off my chest. But because I had responsibilities, because it wasn't just me fighting in this world any longer. I had a family, and I loved that family. And so my curious mind just wanted to know why he didn't feel the same way about me at the time that he gave me away. I just wanted to know those answers. And so I began speaking in a gentle way, as you suggested, with the Bounty Killers lyrics. I wanted to know if there was any kind of suffering in his life to explain the way he behaved. So that is how our conversation began. I asked him about his own childhood, about his own upbringing and how his parents treated him. And I didn't get the full answers on the first day and first week, but at least I started to chip away that pride that he has and chip away at that. It's not his fault. It's so many other people's fault. I began to chip away at that instead of just going crazy and calling him names. We had a proper man-to-man conversation. And all the while I was thinking, say I raise my kids and they're angry with me, what am I going to do? So that had a big influence on me. I wanted, even at that point, even thousands of miles away in Jamaica, I wanted to lead by example, if you like. I wanted to go back to the UK and say, look, I had this issue with my father, but I managed to get over it through discussion and talk and understanding, rather than come back and say, oh, I lost my temper and hit him. That would not have been a great example. So I wanted some kind of example that I could show them, yes, I'm still trying to be a good father here, for you, because ultimately I wanted my children to get to know their grandfather. For me, that's a very important relationship. Yep. And sometimes we forget that. Yep. And so I had thoughts of him coming over to the UK and visiting his grandchildren. I wanted to be like any other family where those relationships can grow and you could get so much out of.
It sounded like you were trying to mend generations.
That's correct. Yeah. I was trying to mend generations.
It seemed like you were on this very deliberate path for building legacy. You wanted to heal generations and bring generations together. So you have your 3 children. What have you learned from your father that you actively choose to accept or ignore when it comes to raising your own children?
Well, the main thing I learned is that I wanted to break that link where he had difficulties with his own father. He felt that he was treated harshly growing up. He felt there was too much expected of him. He felt that his father never really engaged with him. It was his mother who he was closest to out of his parents. And it was his mother who he would turn to if he had a problem. It was never the father. The father was quite aloof, and his his father, my grandfather, he would spend hours, 14 hours a day working at a pump house on a farm. And so he hardly ever saw him anyway. And so he wasn't that much of an influence on his life. And he desperately wanted to impress him. But anything he did, nothing really did impress him. So when he used to come home with schoolwork, he would just have a look and go back to his rolled up cigar or cigarette or his newspaper. He'd never play with him. He would never spend any quality time with him. And I think that damaged him growing up. I'm not trying to give him excuses, but for me, growing up the way I did,
Right.
I wanted to try and understand why he ultimately made that decision where he didn't come back for me. And I don't think it was something that he did purposefully. I just don't think he could handle the emotions of it all. He's not a man who could handle himself emotionally very well at all because of that disconnect with his own father. And it's something that I wanted to correct if I could, through him. And this is why I wanted him to meet his grandchildren, because he had another opportunity. I wanted to give him that opportunity of getting to know his grandchildren. That was important for me. And also because grandparents can offer so much wisdom to the grandchildren.
Yep.
There's no doubt about that. And I think sometimes what I have observed in Black families is something that I feel is missing. I mean, we discussed the Windrush situation before we come on air, and many of the Windrush generation, they've now gone home to Jamaica, gone back to the life that they've always wanted to live, retire in a big house, relaxing on their veranda, back to the warm weather. But sometimes I think our children here need to see them. They need to interact with them. They need to learn from them. Just like I wanted my children to learn from my father, even though he's made his mistakes and so on. I think, if you make mistakes, it doesn't mean that you cannot give to the family or the legacy you leave behind. And that's why I wanted to foster some kind of togetherness through the generations. And it was through Simeon where I learned that, because he had his own issues and problems with his family in Jamaica, because he turned Rasta. And that was a big deal, especially.
That would be a big issue. That's a big
It was
deal.
a massive issue in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And his family were devoted church members. And he was a teenager and he started to lock up his hair. And his father never forgave him. His mother never forgave him. And so from that experience, I thought, wow, there's another disconnection there. So I think Simeon, I think that's one of the reasons why he went back, because he wanted to heal that disconnect that he had in his young life.
So I know your dad died a few years ago.
Yeah.
How do you think of him now? And have your feelings towards him changed over the years?
Yes, more or less. Yes. He was a man, he had his flaws, but no doubt he was an educated man. He was a skilled carpenter. He built his own house. He tried his best. But again, he was damaged, and I'll give him some leeway because of that.
Mm.
And in so many ways, through colonialism and through our history, whether, if you come from the Caribbean, there's going to be that trauma. Somewhere down the line, there's going to be a great trauma. And we have to understand that, learn from it in a way that we raise our own children. Because even when I used to visit my friends in Brixton and I would see Black families interact for the first time, I witness this disconnect sometimes. Well, not
Mm.
sometimes, a lot of the time between young teenagers, male teenagers, and their fathers, where there wasn't much conversation, there wasn't much playtime, there wasn't much doing things together. And I'm thinking, is this normal? I didn't think it was normal because white friends I had, they seemed to have a better relationship with their fathers than my black friends, and that
Mm.
disturbed me in a way. It really did. And sometimes I used to think maybe because that trauma has never been healed.
Hmm. Interesting. Did your own children, did your kids ever ask about their grandfather? And what did you tell them when they asked?
Oh
What
yes,
do you tell them now?
they met him. They met him. They would speak to him
Hmm.
on the phone, and my father would become all scholarly like. He'd always ask them about school and their education and so forth. Are they reading the right books? Are they doing maths? That was his thing, maths. So they had some kind of
Mm.
relationship with him. And he would often tell them about the times when he was a young boy growing up in Old Harbour, Jamaica. He would tell them about
Hmm.
harvest time, when everyone used to cook and, the town or village would come together. They'd have a fire and there'll be a storyteller and he would tell stories from the Bible, and I was pleased about that
Mm.
because that is something I can never do. I did not have the experience of that. And this is why grandparents can sometimes be
Mm.
so important because they can offer something that we can't as a parent.
Hmm. So you write in your memoir that Simeon was your mentor and teacher,
Yeah,
and that he was your strongest father figure.
yeah,
You say that if only we could clone you, so any troubled teenager could listen and learn from your wise words and counsel. As long as I breathe, I'll tell the half that's never been told. Kind of pulling from a bit of Buju Banton there
yeah.
as well. Tell us about this commitment to Simeon and his commitment to you.
Well, for me, he witnessed something in me that I didn't even realize I had. He witnessed and
Mm.
observed a potential, an aspiration, a talent of
Mm.
a life that could be well lived, a life that could contribute to society that I never realized I could see until he started to open my eyes. And, to this day, I'll appreciate that for as long as I live. And so I'm not sure about the US of A or Canada or any other places, but in the UK, we have a big problem with gang warfare, guns, knives, young people being killed for no good reason. And sometimes when I do workshops in prisons and institutions, these young people, when I speak to them, they're very intelligent. they just made wrong choices and, make wrong decisions at the worst times. And sometimes they carry knives or guns because of the fear or because there's no direction in their home lives, or they might have missing fathers, or for whatever reason, there's something missing from their lives. And this is why I say if we had more Simeons in our community, it could be London, New York, Toronto, then I believe the world would be a better place where, I could have easily led that kind of life where I might have picked up a knife because I'm so angry with the world and look for other places to follow rather than the Simeon way, if you like. But, I had found Simeon, so I had someone to look up to, someone who I knew would listen to me, someone who I knew would be compassionate with me.
I think also that Simeon found you.
Oh, yes.
Because I am sure if he were here today, he would say how much your life gave him purpose.
Absolutely.
And made him feel alive to be able to see you succeed. How then can we encourage more people to stand up for children, to act as father figures to children who don't have fathers?
That's a very good question. I guess to take an interest in the community around us, and I know this is very difficult, but to try and tell our young to put down our phones just for a little while and to listen to those people who are in our communities who have great experience, because sometimes we look on older people and we believe they have nothing to offer. But if you give them a chance and if you listen to them, you can always learn something from someone who is older. I strongly believe that. So, we just need to have time to do that and spaces to do that in.
So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. This has just been so rich. So you're a beloved writer and storyteller, and I can't let you go without asking you this last question. What are you working on next?
I'm working on another children's book. It's a book about a young Jamaican girl who's very talented at football, but she comes to the UK to escape an incident that happened to her brother, where she's a witness to a murder, but she wants to carry on with her football in the UK. I'm about halfway through it, and when I finished that, I will start writing on the second book of my memoir.
That sounds pretty busy. That sounds very busy. Wow. Thank you so much for meeting with us today, Alex. It was such a joy to hear you talk about your story, but to also see you, to see the identity that has emerged, to see what Simeon saw.
Yeah.
I am so happy that Simeon was there.
Yeah.
That you met Simeon. Because had you not met Simeon, we would have never gotten to experience the things that you were sharing, that the way that you're changing this world would never have happened if Simeon had not met you. So thank you so much to you, and thank you, Simeon, for supporting you. Thank you so much again, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and the director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva. Our series producer is Joe Ruby. The podcast is supported by the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758. That's Dr_AT758. And on the web at thomaslab.humanecology.wisc.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the Black Fatherhood Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.